We have a massive Leafs trade update to go over today as Elliotte Friedman has dropped a massive report surrounding the Toronto Maple Leafs, revealing some brand new, unheard of information up until this point that changes the landscape of Brad Treliving's plans this offseason as moves inch closer and closer and reports continue to escalate, folks. We're going to break it all down in this episode before we get into it all. If you're part of the percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, this is the place to be for daily Leafs content. You guys have been absolute beasts, so thank you guys for your continued support. There's a lot to go over today, and obviously, Elliotte Friedman dropped a pretty notable report late last night. He had a 32 thoughts written section there, and he revealed some information that makes some sense, but also is pretty new. So let's just dive right into it. And let's start with this here. Now, I discussed it and we discussed in yesterday's video about how I was surprised personally that the Leafs didn't make a push for Mason Marchment. And they did. The Maple Leafs were interested in Mason Marchment and were disappointed that they couldn't land him. And now a wild card option is turning if they move Mitch Marner, meaning, of course, they move on from Mitch Marner, could be trading a defenseman to bring in a forward. And we're going to dive into some reports about what players have speculated, all these different things. I want to get your thoughts on this first, and let us know down below. The Mason Marchment, of course, I believe went for a third and a fourth. The Leafs, you assume, could have matched that. I don't know how they didn't, but it is what it is. They didn't get the deal done. This would have been a perfect fit, but they're now pivoting, and it seems very clear that their full focus, aside from Brad Marchand, which we'll have a video on either tonight or tomorrow, is going to be fully focused on the trade market here. And I'm still disappointed in Mason Marchment, but it seems like they're going to be open to moving a defenseman in order to acquire a forward, and then I guess either sign another defenseman or have some faith in a guy like Philip Myers.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second in terms of what they're going to be doing and how active they're going to be on the trade market. But I think they're going to do less in free agency than they are via trade this offseason, which is, going to be very exciting. That's for sure, because I have no idea what you're going to be able to trade. The cupboard is very bare right now. But in terms of Mason Marchment, it's an interesting one. I have a hard time believing the Leafs couldn't match what the Seattle Kraken gave up. And the fact that Seattle Kraken are in the Western Conference is just a weird one to me for the Dallas Stars. But nonetheless, the Toronto Maple Leafs couldn't make that trade happen. It does suck because Mason Marchment was a Toronto Maple Leaf. They had this player in the organization, and you always kind of knew he was going to become this player. He's not a superstar or anything, but he can play second line wing for you. So it would have been a nice little acquisition there for the Toronto Maple Leafs on the second line. But that's done and gone, and they have to look at other options via trade this offseason.
Yeah, and obviously I wanted him, but let's dive into the second part here. We're about moving on from Mitch Marner. Now, you can see this here. We're going to dive into a couple different things as well as some other reports. Now, Leafs updates kind of speculating that OEL for a solid forward wouldn't be a bad idea, and I'm going to dive into Morgan Rielly here in a minute, but let's start with Oliver Ekman-Larsson because, again, Elliotte Friedman's reporting that they're going to be active in trade talks and hinting at the fact that they can move a defenseman to replace of course, forward, which is Mitch Marner. Here's some of your thoughts on this because you look at teams like the New York Rangers, which we'll dive into in a minute here, and reports coming out from David Pagnotta saying that the Maple Leafs are more active in exploring options in the trade market than they are in free agency. You line all these reports up, and it seems like a move here makes a lot of sense, and we'll dive into the lines here in a moment, but I think if they're going to make a move for a defenseman, or I guess with a defenseman rather, for a forward, you have to really start to consider, A, who your other defenseman is going to be, or maybe they'll acquire one, but B, what type of player. And Mika Zibanejad keeps getting brought up in conversations, and I have to circle back to it because I still think that based on, like you mentioned, the cupboard being empty, you would if they're going to make a big blockbuster move, it would be for a player like Zibanejad, given the fact that his salary is a lot, and then Drury doesn't, and the Rangers don't really want to keep that player on the team. I'm not saying an OEL for, Zibanejad swap directly. I'm thinking more of a Morgan Rielly for Zibanejad swap, but it's going to be, I think, deals like this that are most likely to get done, but just reports everywhere that they're going to be exploring the trade market, which doesn't make a ton of sense. They gave up 2 first-round picks and 2 prospects at last year's trade deadline. They still do have a lot of assets, and quite frankly, they have a lot of NHL caliber talent, that a lot of depth in the defense core there. So maybe they'd want to move on, but the only 2 that I could really think they'd move on from would be Rielly and OEL. I can't see them moving on from Carlo, Tanev, or McCabe. So I think one of Rielly or OEL in a framework like this would be traded.
I think you're right, and I think they're going to move off somebody, if they are, trading a defenseman, somebody off the left side there. And I think that it could be Morgan Rielly. Again, he has to waive his no movement clause, which everyone has at this point. And obviously OEL. I think that's an interesting one because if you look at the New York Rangers, again, Zibanejad, I don't think wants to move. That's the biggest thing. But Chris Drury has his way with players over the last, 12 months or so. And even if you have a no movement clause, that doesn't really matter if you're a New York Ranger, or so it seems that way. But they need a left defenseman. They're trading Keandre Miller, which I think could also be interesting for the Toronto Maple Leafs, but he's going to make a lot of money. So we could save that for another video. But, they need a left defenseman. They're moving off of 2 of them this offseason, probably this week coming. So they could use a Morgan Riley that could play with Adam Fox, or they could use, an OEL on the left side there. And they want to save cap, which they would be doing in both moves if Zibanejad were to come the other way. And Zibanejad could come to the Leafs and play wing, where he actually was really good last year for half the season when he was playing wing. So it's an interesting idea. The Leafs are in a weird spot right now where, if you look like 3, 4 years ago, the defense, the goaltending was always a problem. Now I feel like it's flip-flopped where you have to figure out what you're doing with the offense because as you can see here, there's a lot of placeholders. Like some of these guys are definitely not going to be on the team next season. But, when you look at the defense and the goaltending, it's almost solidified. I'm sure they're going to make some moves still, but it's looking pretty strong. And I feel like you can trade one piece away to, fill in a gap on offense. So it's going to get very interesting. But again, I think the Leafs are going to be somewhat active in free agency. Probably one big splash. It could be Brad Marchand. We know they're going to be very aggressive in trying to get him. But I feel like most of the work to try and get the team to be better, at least in terms of forwards, is going to be done via trade this offseason.
And you can see here within this, I kind of glanced over. He did say that the Leafs could have interest in Arthur Staple did insider. The Rangers did say that the Leafs could have interest in Zibanejad, but also lately Jonas Siegel came out recently and said when it comes to contract and term, I would rather have Mika Zibanejad over Sam Bennett on the Maple Leafs. And of course, Sam Bennett, almost all but surefire now that he's going to return to the Florida Panthers. But at the same time, the Mika Zibanejad stuff's heating up a little bit. You pair that with the timing of the Elliotte Friedman report about, of course, Mitch Marner being. I mean, we all know Mitch Marner is going to be gone. But moving a defenseman again is new information. You look at the defenseman core here again. We all know who it is. Assuming I think Riley's the most likely for both sides. If a deal like this gets done, I think the Rangers would probably prefer Riley over OEL, and also the Leafs would probably prefer to give up Riley over OEL given the cap and all those things. Riley does have 4 years left in his deal. They would then have to replace their defenseman. Now, would this be via free agency? It's possible. They have Philip Meyer. They have some other guys that they could acquire or use from the Marlies. But do you have any thoughts on the replacement option for the defenseman? Again, I think a deal is going to get done here. I expect them to make a big splash. I wouldn't be surprised if they sign Brad Marchand and maybe pay a little bit more than they would have liked to initially, and then make a trade regarding a defenseman to not necessarily get off cap, but to kind of make up for the extra money they paid there rather than giving up a ton in free agency, just given the fact that, the way the cap is and the way that this is trending regarding the amount of money these players are going to get.
Yeah, well, in terms of, your question, like it makes sense that trade, right? Like you could make that trade and it makes a lot of sense for the Toronto Maple Leafs and the New York Rangers. I think that's the biggest thing where a lot of people come up with trade scenarios and it makes no sense for the other side. For the Rangers, it would make a lot of sense. But a lot of people are going to scoff at this. If you do trade Morgan Riley, like I think in this scenario, it's a lot easier to trade OEL, even though I love what he brings to a team and the Toronto Maple Leafs specifically. It's a lot easier to trade him than it is Morgan Riley because if you're trading Morgan Riley, and I'm not calling him a number one defenseman, you have to go get a number one defenseman at this point. Chris Tanev's great, but then you have no number one defense, like not even close, maybe not even a number two. And I think Chris Tanev's fantastic, but you just don't. And he's getting older, right? That's something you have to consider. So I think it would be a lot easier in this scenario to give up like an OEL, let's say, than Morgan Riley, but it still makes sense to me. You're going to need to add forwards here. They can't score. That's the biggest thing in the playoffs. If you look at the Florida Panthers, most of the scoring was done by guys on the bottom six, and they were making no more than $1 million, besides Brad Marchand, who also was making less than $1 million because, the year was basically done and all the salary was paid. But anyway, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what Brad Treliving does because he's got to get creative here. He's built himself a pretty good team from the back end to the goaltending. I do believe that it's a very good team, but now the forwards, what do you do with the forward group? Because who's going to be here. We assume Matthew Knies that contract's probably going to get done. We still don't have any idea what's happening with John Tavares, to be honest. Like he could actually still be out the door. And then obviously you have Nylander and Austin Matthews. Like the rest you can play with, honestly. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they do. And I think they're going to get very creative. And Brad Treliving, like I said, doesn't like to be active around trade deadlines or in season. He likes to build his teams in the offseason, and he likes to do things like Brandon Carlo where nobody really sees it coming. So it's going to be interesting, and for better or for worse with the Matthew Tkachuk trade, but obviously he was pinned in the corner with that one. But it's going to be interesting to see what he does.
Yeah, let's not blow your thoughts are. Reports are picking up, and there's a lot of moves that are going to be on the horizon. We'll keep you up to date with the latest. Make sure to hit the subscribe button. See you.